Hello guitarists, welcome to this video. My name is Kurt, and on behalf of Sonora Guitar Intensive, we wonder, do you ever find that when you're bending that it's kind of like fumbling around in the dark trying to find the exact pitch you were shooting for? Or perhaps you find that the adjacent strings ring out so much as you bend that it makes a cacophonous mess of the otherwise, hopefully, more musical sound you could have had. Perhaps you do the inchworm technique, and it's totally undermining your best efforts to make, again, an expressive use of bends and vibrato. Well, all of those issues and more are addressed in the masterclass that follows, and this masterclass is presented by the great Seth Rosenbloom, who, if you don't know by name, rest assured, you soon will. Seth is one of the very best young blues guitarists in the country. Joe Bonamassa himself has called Seth one of his favorite young players. And Seth, in addition to being a great player, is a wonderful and articulate educator, as you'll soon see. And he will diagnose in this following masterclass a number of ways in which developing players undermine their bends and their vibrato technique, and share with you all the ways in which you can adjust your technique to get the crystal clear and musical expressions that these techniques allow for. There will also be a series of exercises that he shares that you can work through. And suffice it to say, this is about as focused a study as one could hope for, led by as great an instructor as one could hope for. And we hope that you enjoy it. If you do enjoy it, I'd encourage you to subscribe to our channel because we have plenty more content like this to come. And now, here's Seth.
We're going to dive into bending and vibrato. So overall technique for those, and then also application. Now, bending and vibrato, I look at as more or less one and the same, in the sense that the technique that we're going to use to be able to play them is somewhat similar. Generally, players who have great vibrato also will bend quite well, and vice versa. Now, first thing we're going to cover is the technique. Then we'll get into how we'd use it, all of that. So some of the things that I see with vibrato and bends, there's one thing at the top of the list that I see happen a lot, and to me is the hardest thing to overcome technique-wise to then have good results bending and vibrato-wise. And that is what I call inchworming. So a lot of the times when I'm working with a student on vibrato or bending, I see this happen, where none of that sounded all that great. The bends weren't in tune. And what was happening is that motion was basically coming from me lengthening and shortening my fingers. And I think of it kind of like an inchworm. That is what we want to avoid. The technique that I want to see for bending and vibrato is coming from a rotation of the forearm. So it's the idea, I always equate it either to like the royal wave of, if you've seen the Queen wave, or I guess now the King, or if it's like you have something on your hand and you're trying to flick it off. So it's a rotation where all we want to ask the fingers to do is to fret the note and bring the string along for the ride. So what we have going here is if I start off with just the 7th fret on the G string. So I like to start off with something where I'm using my first finger, not on the high E. I want something middle of the neck. And I'm going to use vibrato and go towards the floor, because with bends and vibrato, we have ones where we're going down and we're also going up. So you'll hear me say to the floor and to the ceiling. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to fret that note with my first finger. And from there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that this part of my left hand, kind of right there where the first finger meets the palm, that needs to have contact with the side of the neck, because that is going to be what our pivot point is. We need some kind of pivot point for the vibrato to happen. So I fret the note, and all I'm going to do from there is pull down. So I'm actually, before I actually get it sounding like a real vibrato, I'm basically doing a series of half-step bends there. And if you notice, there's nothing about the finger on my left hand that is wiggling. The only job of that finger is to fret the note. And from there, I'm just turning my forearm. So I feel like my palm is moving away from me. It has that feel. And you absolutely want to end up... hold on, I've got a question in there. Yeah, that's taken care of. Sorry, there was something in the chat about the Q&A. But yeah, you absolutely want to feel like that first finger is just fretting the note, and from there, you're pulling down. The finger itself is taking the string along for the ride. The other thing that you do want to pay attention to is that when you're fretting that note, if you have too much pressure that feels like it's going down into the fretboard, that string's not going to want to move. You have to fret the note enough to make it ring clearly, but then the pressure you want is really going across the fret. So I'm just trying to get this happening. Basically a little half-step bend there. Now, as I do that, all I have to do now is apply some more speed and make it a little less wide. So instead of, we have same motion, but now we start to have it sound like the vibrato. You will notice when I do this going towards the floor, my thumb's not on the neck yet. It's solely feeling that rotating of the forearm, and by having the thumb off the neck, we can really feel that ability to rotate. Now, what's the thumb's job then? Well, the thumb's job when you're using vibrato is for control. So if I have my thumb off the fretboard or off the back of the neck completely, I'm going to feel like I can still use that vibrato, but I don't really have the ability to change the character of the vibrato. I don't necessarily have the ability to make it slower, faster, wider, narrower. I kind of just have to go where my hand feels good and with it rotating. But if I then add the thumb's what's going to give me control to have it more narrow, to have it wider, faster, slower, all of that. And what that really plays a part in, with vibrato, we don't always want the same vibrato. If we're playing over a ballad, we're going to want a very different vibrato than if we're playing over an up-tempo tune. Same thing as it has to do with intensity. If we're playing over a song where we want a lot of energy, that's going to require a very different vibrato than if we have something that's more laid back and gentle. We always want to be thinking about matching our vibrato to the song, because largely our vibrato is what gives the singing quality to our playing and really takes care of making us sound musical. So once you've done this with the first finger and you just get used to that, now we want to try to go to another finger. So we're going to take 9th fret on the G, but now we're going to use our 3rd finger. Now, with the 3rd finger, not much actually changes, because the beauty of this technique, where it's a rotation of the forearm, is that the finger itself isn't just pulling the note. So we fret that note, and then it's still that side of the 1st finger against the edge of the neck, and then any fingers we have available behind the finger that we're fretting with are just going to stay on the string and help us brace. Same thing where if I'm going to the floor, the thumb isn't necessary except for basically providing control. So that's what that 3rd finger would look like. And now we have to make sure with the vibrato that we can go up towards the ceiling. Because if we're on the B string or E string, or even sometimes on the G string, we don't have, if I try to go down to the floor on the high E string, that happens. I come off the side of the neck, we have nothing. So for this, I would take 10th fret on the B string. And now I want to go up to the ceiling. Now, what changes when we go towards the ceiling? Well, the major change is going to be that now the thumb really has a job. Because if I don't have the thumb on and try to go to the ceiling, I have no counterbalance. I have nothing making it so that the string will actually go there. So what I now have to do is feel a bit of a squeeze between this part of the first finger into the palm on the bottom side of the neck and then the thumb on the top side of the neck. It's why when you watch me use vibrato, when you watch a lot of players use vibrato, you will see that the thumb comes from where it normally is back here up to here to provide that counter pressure. So same motion where it's still a turning of that palm. And you want to now feel like your palm is basically moving towards your face. Same idea would apply if we're using our third finger to fret the note. Same technique, and the string's just going along for the ride. So now I fret same note with my third finger, and it's still where you can, if you just watch this, you'll see that my palm is moving closer to the neck and then further away. And that's what makes that happen. And you see how all of the angles of my fingers remain the same the entire time. That's what's going to provide the control and consistency. Couple other things to watch out for here. Notice that when I use vibrato, my headstock's not moving. The other thing that I see all the time when guitar players use vibrato, and I know where it comes from some showmanship, is you'll see something like this. Now, that didn't sound like anything. That sounded like me played a note without vibrato, and then I shook the neck. Anytime that headstock's moving, it really just means that you're using the energy in order to do this and not move the string. Because if we all just grip the neck and do this, wiggle the neck back and forth, it doesn't mean that the string is moving. We can do that and the string. Some loud noise there. We can move the neck and have the string stay absolutely straight. So what we need to be able to do is we need to use the vibrato and keep an eye on the headstock, and I want that to stay as still as possible. It'll wiggle a tiny bit, but what we're trying to avoid is this happening, because that's not actually giving us any movement to the string, and it's actually going to end up wasting energy with the neck moving. The one other thing to pay attention to as it relates to the thumb is we want our thumb to more or less be behind the first and second finger. If you try to do this but have the thumb way back towards the headstock, you'll find that you lose some of the freedom of movement. And I look at it this way, of when we're doing anything else, so if we're using our hand just to pick something up, I've got a nice polar seltzer right here. And if I'm picking up that polar seltzer, I would never pick it up like this, where my thumb is way higher than my first and second finger. If I'm grabbing something, my thumb is basically going to be behind my first and second finger. And when we're using it on the neck, we want to think about it in the same way. That's going to be the position that our hands in the most usable way in order to produce the sound. So that takes us through our general vibrato technique. Any other finger, if we're using the second or fourth finger, same things apply. How does this relate to bending? Well, bending is going to be the exact same technique. Because when we're using vibrato, we are actually just having a bunch of little bends. We're basically taking our unbent pitch, we're moving it sharp, we're bringing it back to pitch, moving it sharp, back to pitch. The reason why sometimes you'll hear someone with what I'd call a nervous vibrato is often if they're bending it up and not returning it to pitch. So it ends up staying sharp the whole time. Sounds kind of like this. I can still play vibrato with that speed and width. I just have to be able to return it all the way to where it's unbent. So if I'm applying this to a bend, let's take 9th fret on the G string. And we're going to bend that a whole step. Now, if you've been used to doing this in order to produce a bend, this is going to feel pretty different because this is a much bigger motion than when we were just using it for vibrato. But the idea is going to be, we want to bend that a whole step. So our target pitch is the 11th fret on the G string. So I want everyone to play the 11th fret on the G string, just unbent. The idea here is to get the target pitch in your head. Then you're going to go down with your 3rd finger on the 9th fret of the G and bend it a whole step, matching that pitch you just played. And we're getting there solely from the side of the 1st finger being on the lower side of the neck, thumb bracing here, and then feeling like that palm is coming up towards our face. So it's a turning of the forearm, it's not this. And you hear how much worse that intonation is when I start to just push with my fingers. It doesn't sound nearly as crisp, doesn't sound as in tune. And with that one note, so the 9th fret on the G, I want everyone to try matching that pitch of the 11th fret, both going towards the ceiling, so doing this, and then also going towards the floor. So that you can feel it's really the same technique going both ways, just with some small differences. And that's going to allow you, with that one technique, to use vibrato on any string. Again, if we're on, say, the high E string, we always have to go to the ceiling. Has to be. Same thing with the B. If I tried to go down with that bend at the 10th fret of the B, I'm off the edge of the neck. So we are limited by what string we are on in terms of which direction we can go with the bend. But the whole idea here is to, when you're practicing it, take your pitch that you're trying to match. So if we're doing a whole step bend, it would be 2 frets up, and then bend up to that pitch. Now, when we're bending, eventually we don't want to be relying on our ear to hit those pitches we want. When I work on my bending, I'm largely working on the muscle memory of knowing what each bend feels like. Because if we're solely reliant on our ear with our bends, we're going to be limited as to the types of bends we can use. By that, I mean that if I am always listening for when I get to that right pitch, every bend has to be this. But what happens when I want this sound? For any fans of like a Jeff Beck or a Michael Landau or Jimmy Herring, you know that sound of a pre-bend where you're bending it to pitch, then picking it. And that's only possible if you know what that bend at that part of the neck feels like. So how do we work on that? Well, we go to that same exercise where, say I'm at the 7th fret of the high E string, and I want to know how to bend that whole step. Well, I would play the 9th fret of the high E string, because that's my target pitch, And then what I'd do at the 7th fret of the high E is I'd bend the note without picking it, and only when I'm confident I have bent it to the correct pitch do I pick it. And then we check it again. So I was pretty much right on there. At first, you might have this happen where you play the target pitch and you bend it, you think you're there. Whoa, I'm way flat. So you start to get a feedback loop of if you're in tune, if you're not. And the idea is that if you practice this all over the neck, you get a sense of the different feelings of the bend. Because if I'm bending a whole step at the 5th fret of the G string, so trying to match this pitch, it's going to feel way different than, say, bending at the 18th fret of the high E. And if you want to be able to be confident anywhere on the neck, you have to know that feeling of bends all over. Then your ear will help you fine tune it and basically take it the last 10 to 15%. So if you can get right in that ballpark without listening to that rise of the bend, at that point, you can use your ear to finish it off. And when I was younger, hadn't worked on it this way, there was one song that I was learning that really made me work on it this way, and this is the one it was. I don't know, it's hard to do a show of hands here, but how many people know the song "'Cause We've Ended as Lovers" by Jeff Beck? Great tune. I see some hands. So it's a cool chord progression. The chord progression is C minor 7 or like C minor 9 to A flat major 7 to F minor 7. And then it goes like C sus to C. It's been a long time since I've actually played it. But the melody for that, I think he originally does play it without bends, but the melody goes... I can't play it without bends because I only have learned it with bends. So I always played that with pre-bends, and in order to get it with pre-bends, have to be able to do this. So you hear how I have no way of listening for when I'm hitting that correct pitch. I have to know the feeling of each of those bends before I do it. Now, same thing applies where you see that my headstock when I'm doing the bends, it's not jerking up like that. Because if it is, again, I'm wasting energy. I'm moving the headstock up. I'm not moving the strings. So you'll notice that that stays very what I'd call quiet. It's not moving all that much. And this allows me to access any kind of bend. So I can get the rise up to it. I can get a pre-bend where we just hear the fall. I can get it really quick going up. And it's the exact same exercise I've used most recently. I've put in a ton of work on making sure that I can do this same thing with minor third bends and major third bends. Because I love, like the old B.B. King thing of doing... So I'm playing 13th fret on the G string, 12th fret on the B, and then I'm bending the 14th fret of the high E, a minor third, so matching the pitch of the 17th fret on the high E. So and to be able to do that, I worked on it the same way of, okay, I'm going to play 17th fret on the high E and then pre-bend it and check it. Same thing where studying a lot of Albert King, especially recently, like we touched on a couple weeks ago, major third bends. So for example, on the B string, being able to bend, say, the 14th fret up to the 18th. So checking it, that 18th fret, and then I'd play something. So being able to pre-bend it and match that pitch. The more comfortable you can become at doing this exercise, the more confident you're going to be in your bends, because once we take bends and vibrato for that point into context, so when we're not just practicing it on its own in a vacuum, it all gets much harder, because at that point we don't have the time to think about the bend for all that long. We just have to go for it, and we have to know that when we do that, we've practiced enough that it's going to hit that correct pitch when we're doing it in context. There are a lot of things I think about with applying all this to real world situations. So most of how we create our own unique sound in terms of the left hand comes from articulation. So that includes everything from slides and how we touch the string and how we fret the string, but largely that comes from bends and vibrato. All great players, you can name almost any, especially when you get into like blues players and rock players, you're going to know who they are from one note they play. And why is that? Well, they all have a different vibrato. Like, you know that sound of B.B. King's vibrato compared to Stevie Ray Vaughan's vibrato. It's distinctive. It's one of the things that puts that trademark touch on their playing, on their sound. Now, in addition to that, any player with a great vibrato, you're going to end up hearing that, as I said earlier, if they're playing over a ballad, their vibrato is going to be very different. So I have a couple backing tracks here. This first one's like kind of a Stax style backing track, key of C. And if I'm playing over this, so I have a pretty fast vibrato there going on to match the tempo. Now, if I take that same backing track and now slow it down, where pretty much slow blues, my vibrato is going to change pretty drastically. So depending what I'm playing there, it's still the same overall vibrato. Like, no matter what I'm playing over, it's going to sound like me, just like you're going to sound like you. But I'm thinking of it as basically two like light dimmer switches. One where I can adjust width. I can go with really wide or really narrow. And another one where I can adjust speed. So I can go fast or slow. And then I can set those two in any combination that I want to. So I could have a wide and fast vibrato. I could have a wide and slow vibrato. I could have a narrow and fast vibrato. I could have a narrow and slow vibrato. Will all of those combinations sound great? No. But the idea is that if we can access all of those different combinations of fast, slow, wide, narrow, we then have the ability to tailor it to the song, make it sound like however we want, and also have full artistic freedom. Because most of what we're looking for here is to artistically be able to use the vibrato and, as an extension, the bends in any way that we want. I do see one question, sorry I didn't get to it earlier, in the chat, and then I'll start to open this up for a few questions and we'll take it from there. What gauge strings am I using? I'm using 11 to 49. I pretty much have settled with 11s on a Strat or Tele or Fender style guitar. Occasionally when I play Gibson scale length, I'll go to 12s, although more recently I've been sticking with 11s on there. I like the feel of heavier strings. Basically, I play the heaviest strings that I still feel like I can bend how I want, which happen to be 11s. When I go to 12s on a Strat, I lose that ability to do this and lose the ability to do, and I like to be able to do that. The reason I like the heaviest strings I can handle is because I feel like it gives me the most dynamic range. So I feel like when I want to be able to play super loud, I have the ability to, without just moving the volume knob, I can really dig in, but it takes a bit for that string to start vibrating as much as it possibly can. And in the same vein, I can, if I want to play super quiet, I have that ability to be able to play really quiet. I see another question that popped up here. Curious if I have an issue with catching other strings while bending. I occasionally get other tapping or pull-off tones when I don't want them. Any tips? Absolutely. So big part of bending and vibrato, especially on wider vibrato, is going to be muting. So if I don't mute anything and I just bend, so I'm going to really try to just play the one string, you start to hear some extraneous noise ring out. So when I'm bending, if I'm bending, say, the 11th fret on the B, a whole step, you'll notice that my first finger on my left hand is kind of flattened out. Now, why is that? Well, it's actually not pressing down. What it's doing is it's covering these strings so that they're not going to ring out. My palm is taking care of muting the lowest strings, and then the underside of my first, second fingers is muting the high E string. So everything is muted in some way or another. Muting is largely a trial and error activity of just like that. I can show you everything muting wise that I'm doing, but it has to work with the way that you fret the notes and the way that you use your right hand. For someone that maybe floats more with the right hand, they're going to have to rely more on the left hand than I will, because I stay pretty low to the string, and vice versa. Depending on your overall technique, that's going to affect the muting. But it was something that was kind of a hard lesson for me to learn as it related to bending and vibrato, but in general. I think I was about 17 or 18 and had a friend on a pretty big tour with a singer, and they were playing festivals and stuff. And he invited me down to hang out, and we were at sound check, and he handed me his guitar, and the back line was like 2 Marshall JCM 800s, which is a lot of amp. So basically 200 watts of amp. And when I had gigged, I had played loudish amps, but I had always had them pretty low. And there is a thing that you learn when you're gigging on loud amps and loud stages, because everything just wants to ring more. When you're at home and you're playing quieter, some of those little notes ringing out or extra noise doesn't stick out all that much, but it's like an accelerant of when you get the amps that loud, everything feeling like you really have to control it, it gets that much harder. It's one of the things that has always been impressive to me about like an Eddie Van Halen. He plays that clean, he plays with that much groove, and he's playing, I mean, the EVH amps more recently, but in the 80s, it was like 4 Marshall plexis and just turned up. That is not a very forgiving tone to play, and he's running around the stage while doing it. Muting is a huge part of good bending and vibrato, but also just being able to play in a band situation, especially if you play with some degree of gain, overdrive, or distortion.